His evolution is not a linear one. He changes from light to dark and back again, and the Batmobile changes in shape and character and power and design again and again to reflect that.
Stop.
Hi, I'm Glenn Weldon from NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour. I'm also the author of The Caped Crusade, Batman and the Rise of Nerd Culture. Today I'm going to be walking you through every Batmobile from film and television.
Batman.
In this, the Batmobile is basically just a 1939 Cadillac Series 75 convertible. It's just a car. Now, to put that in some context, the Batmobile was introduced very early in Detective Comics 27, and it was also just a car, as it started out. It was a red roadster. It was Bruce Wayne's car, as a matter of fact. And if you go back and read those early issues, they spend a tremendous amount of time just having him figure out a place to park it before he goes and fights crime. He hadn't mastered the whole secret identity thing yet. And the Batman of the serial, same thing. Hadn't really figured out the whole secret identity thing yet.
Get in the back and change. I'll drive.
While in the comics, the Batmobile by this point was a beast of a car, which is highly stylized, with a lot of the stuff that you're going to see in other Batmobiles going forward. It has a big hood ornament, kind of battering ram bat head. It's got a giant single bat wing tail fin, and they could get away with that in the comics because comics have an unlimited special effects budget. Movie serials were made on the cheap. The way they differentiated it is that when the top was down, it was Bruce Wayne's car, and when the top was up, it was Batman's. And criminals recognized it as such. An interesting point is that Alfred the butler chauffeured both Batman and Bruce around in that Batmobile.
Alfred, drive into that alley and put the top up.
Doesn't make any sense, but comics don't make any sense. I mean, Superman wears eyeglasses, nobody recognizes him. Batman puts the top up, nobody recognizes him. Now, at this point, comic book heroes didn't really have personalities. They were just cops in capes. And in this case, in the movie serial, Batman is just a detective, just a cop, in a Batman costume.
Dr. Decker? Who's that?
Never mind, you'll find out.
And if you go back and watch these serials, they are products of their time. They were made during the war. They're incredibly racist toward Japanese people.
Pretty good, Saki. Your accent's a little off, but your makeup is perfect.
Its anti-Japanese sentiment is right there on the surface. Next up, the 1949 Batman and Robin movie serial. It's a 1949 Mercury, again, just a car. The same deal as before. When the top is up, it's the Batmobile. When the top is down, it's Bruce Wayne's whip.
We'll look into that explosion as Batman and Robin.
In the comics, at this point, the design of the Batmobile was constantly evolving. You throw in a mobile crime lab, you throw in a big bubble canopy, you throw in bat wings, tail fins that kind of grew and shrank over and over again. It would take another 17 years before we got another live-action Batmobile, and by that time the Batman of television had learned about branding from the Batman of the comics. All right, here it is, the 1966 Batman television series Batmobile. Now, I grew up watching this series in reruns, and that's why to members of my generation and those older, this is the iconic, the quintessential, the seminal Batmobile. The TV show had two things going for it that the serials didn't. One, a budget, and two, style for days. This show arrived at the height of the pop art movement. The pop art movement valued things that were slick and commercial and colorful and disposable, which is why they reacted to comic books and comic book heroes in such a big way. This show became a phenomenon, a fad. And everything about it, its iconography, the show's sensibility, which is to take very silly things very seriously.
It doesn't seem to make sense.
And especially this Batmobile invaded the cultural consciousness and became cause celebs. The Batmobile's design here is based on the Ford concept car, the Futura, which never went into production. You'll see echoes of this Batmobile in just about every Batmobile that comes after it. You'll see twin bubble canopies again. You'll see this color scheme, red and black. It won't come back again until Batman Beyond, but it's going to come back. Both of those things make this car seem sporty, which is odd because it is a barge. It is a long, low rectangle of heavy steel with no clearance. Pray that there's no potholes or speed bumps in Gotham City. It looks great, and it is great going forward in a straight line, but zero maneuverability. I mean, the turning radius on this thing is a literal joke on the show. Whenever Batman needs to make a U-turn, he deploys a couple of parachutes to turn the car around. And then a van comes, the Batmobile parachute pickup van service, to pick them up, which just shows you how much Bruce Wayne is propping up the economic infrastructure of Gotham City. Now, one thing this show did was to take the comics of the time and play them very straight. That's where the humor came from. Batman and all comic book heroes were for kids. People didn't really know the character that well because he was relegated to the comic books, which were read by a few thousand kids. By the time the show ends, you'll see a different kind of readership. Teens and adults start reading comics. Superheroes get personalities and personality disorders to distinguish them one from the other. Something besides their costume differentiates them in terms of their personalities. This Batmobile isn't about performance. It's about looking great. It's about looking powerful and branding.
Moments later, from the secret Batcave deep beneath Wayne Manor, they roar out to protect life, limb, and...
All right, this one's from the Batman-Superman Adventure Hour in 1968, an animated series. This is the first animated Batmobile, and it has echoes of the 1966 live-action Batmobile, of course, but it's much sportier, and it is actually, if you look, it's more influenced by racing cars and sports cars of the time. It's got a very simplified design to make it easy to animate. It's got one flourish, which are those oversized bat wings, which are so big that in the real world they wouldn't be so much aerodynamic as aerolethargic. In comics and animation of the time, the technology was such that black objects lost any sense of texture. They looked like black blobs, which is why this design comes with those white highlights. It's not ideal, especially if you are having any scenes taking place at night, but 4 years later, they came up with a solution. Super Friends, 1973. Notice the kind of blue we're looking at here. It's a very light blue, a very friendly blue, because this Batman is still the bright, friendly, careful chum, pedestrian safety Batman who works by day, pals around with other heroes. Over the course of his career in and out of the comics, Batman has cycled through 3 phases again and again. He's a dark, lone avenger of the night. He becomes a compassionate father figure to Robin, and then eventually becomes a patriarch of an extended Bat family. Every time he does that, goes through that cycle, he lightens up a bit. But eventually he will go back to being a dark, lone avenger of the night. In popular culture up this time, in 1973, the 66 Batman and the 66 Batmobile just hung around because the show was such a cultural phenomenon. In the comics, of course, something much different was going on. The hardcore fans of Batman, who read the comics, hated everything about that 1966 show, and as soon as it was over, the makers of Batman took him back to his roots. They kicked Robin out, sent him off to college, and turned Batman into an obsessed, brooding loner, back to his original roots. All of the trappings of the 1966 Batman television series were rejected. There was no more Batcave, there was no more Batmobile. The Batman of the comics at the time, as this Batmobile was on television, was driving a sports car.
The Riddler must be losing his marbles if he thinks he can outdrive me.
This is the Challenge of the Super Friends from 1978. This is an evolution of the Super Friends show. And here again, you see how big an impact the 66 Batmobile had. It's going to take something huge, something unprecedented, and something that could make a cultural impact as big or larger as the Batman television series to get out from under the shadow of this particular design. And here it is, the Batman movie, 1989, directed by Tim Burton. 23 years after the 1966 series, we got the thing that made as big a cultural impression, if not larger. Tim Burton's Batman was an event. Summer of 1989, you couldn't escape it. The Bat logo was everywhere. Promotional clips of the movie played over and over again on television, and many of them featured this film's radical revision of the Batmobile. This is back to being a show of force, of power, dark, heavy. If the 1966 Batmobile had a sullen teenage goth son, this would be it. It is again about design over functionality. This Batmobile was designed by Julian Caldo and Keith Short. Caldo did the illustrations, and Short did the final body sculpt. Looks great on the page, looks great on the screen with those swooping fenders, but again, no turning radius to speak of. If it needs to do a quick turn, it deploys a grappling hook instead of parachutes. I do have one quibble, and it's a big one. It comes with retractable front-mounted machine guns, pretty much the antithesis of everything the character's about, but then so is Alfred letting Vicky Vale into the Batcave. So is the Joker killing Bruce Wayne's parents. I mean, that's Hollywood. Now, there were fans of the comics, of course, who were now teenagers and adults who were taking their character very seriously, but this was a complete surprise to normals. People who just went to see the movie had no idea that Batman was this dark and brooding now, because the last time they had seen the character, he was a joke.
Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
And that's what they went in expecting, and that's not quite what they got. As the film was being made, hardcore fans hated everything they heard about it. They hated the armored batsuit. They hated Jack Nicholson as the Joker. They hated a lot of aspects of what they were seeing. When the film came out, it was widely praised, even by hardcore Bat fans, especially by hardcore Bat fans, because suddenly they could share this thing they loved with people who didn't read comics or didn't watch animated series. Suddenly, Batman was the lingua franca, was all over the place. He was sports now, and that was a brand new experience for them. All right, this is Batman the Animated Series, 1992. If you take the Tim Burton Batmobile and you flatten it into the shape of the 66 Batman television show Batmobile, and you swap out all those swoopy goth elements that Burton put in, and you go for something a little bit more elegant, more refined, more restrained. You take Art Deco elements, and there you have it. You've got the Animated Series Batmobile. It basically looks like if you took the Chrysler Building, toppled it over, and put some wheels on it to tootle around Gotham City. Now, to people who grew up with this show, this Batmobile is iconic to them as the 66 Batmobile is to me. I think that has something to do with its placement, its prominent placement in the opening credits. This Batmobile comes into your home every day, always in the same way, at the exact same time. Every episode of the 1966 series started the same way, and when that happens, it imprints on your brain, on your very soul. It's an almost ritualistic experience. Something else it has in common with the 1966 series is that it is stylized, so heavily stylized that it ceases to be of a specific time. It is out of time. This show is taking elements from many different time periods and mashing them together, so it doesn't look dated. It looks stylish. It looks iconic. And the elements that it has, the Art Deco elements, are timeless. In the 1993 episode, The Mechanic, we learn the origin of the Batmobile. It looks a little bit different here. This design is one of the show's many, many, many homages to Golden Age comics, when the Batmobile sported an enormous bat-head battering ram like this one. Joel Schumacher took over the Batman films from Tim Burton, and when he did, he was tasked by the studio with two objectives. One, lighten up Burton's kind of dark S&M tinged universe, and two, sell some toys. He replaced the somber, heavy, goth excess of Tim Burton with a different kind of excess, his very own. Neon, lasers, fluorescent paint. He threw in more Bat costumes and more Bat vehicles.
What do you suggest, Alfred? By sea or by air?
Term toyetic comes into play here. Toyetic means easily licensed for toys, games, and merch. I would argue that this Batmobile is not just toyetic, it is sex toyetic. It is undeniably phallic. It is lit from within, it is ribbed for their pleasure. If Vegas was a marital aid, it looks something like this. One of the things about Batman is that he's open to a lot of different interpretations. There's not one single kind of Batman, there's different Batmans, because again, he cycles through various stages. Schumacher is a visual stylist first and foremost, a storyteller second. If you're going to ding this Batmobile, you would say style over substance. But after all, the line between stylish and garish is a very personal one. You can see all the familiar elements underneath that glamour. I think of this as the Batmobile in drag, and I don't hate it. But again, in terms of functionality, it's got none. It's got a grappling hook that can allow it to climb vertical walls. What's the exit strategy there exactly? What do you do when you're in the middle of a wall? Its wheels can pivot to allow for perpendicular movement. And when I checked the wiki, there's always a wiki, it said that's explainable by virtue of hyperboloid wheels on axles. I don't know what that means, but it looks cool. Burton's Batman Return was so dark that it was hard to license materials. It was hard to get a deal with McDonald's because it was such a weird film, so tinged with S&M elements, and they wanted to target more directly to kids. So they turned to Joel Schumacher, who made it very bright and very colorful and very gay. Here it's a much lighter version of Batman because, after all, he is mentoring Robin. He's a different kind of figure than the lone grim avenger of the Burton films. Now he's got a kid to take care of, so that brings into it a more kid-friendly approach. Batman and Robin, 1997. We're sticking with Schumacher again. He comes back to direct this, an even more campy, a more direct homage to the 1966 series. You see the cycle is turned. Now this one's based on a roadster. It's a single-seater, because by this point Robin's got his own cycle. And look how far we've come. When you couldn't even see inside Burton's Batmobile, it was all black matte. Here the driver is open to the air, just like the Adam West Batmobile was. Again, the cycle is turning. The Batwing tail fins here are larger than they'll ever be because this approach, Schumacher's approach, is about blithe excess. Bigger, swoopier, campier. He's famous for telling his cast and crew on this film that they're called comic books, not tragic books, which fundamentally misunderstands the whole what comic and comic books mean, but let that go, because that's his approach. He is all about go big or go home, and no one goes home. So once again, the cycle's about to turn. This very popular, very fun, but much disliked by the hardcore fans version of Batman has kind of salted the earth and said, well, nobody can make another Batman film. Just like the 1966 Batman series, it cast a long shadow, people wanted to get out from under it, and it would take a long time for anybody to try it again. And when they did, they had to radically revise how they approached him. The New Batman Adventures, 1997. After the Schumacher Batmobiles, any Batmobile would look like a scaling back, anything would look more grounded. This is a very simplified design, but one that would become part of the DC animated universe for a while. It's one that Batman used in the cartoon Justice League.
Woohoo! Mind not doing that?
Sorry. You scratch it, no allowance.
Batman Beyond, 1999. This is set in a future time period when Batman has retired. He takes under his wing Terry McGinnis, a young punk kid who becomes the Batman of this future age.
You may be used to dealing with freaks and monsters, but I'm a little new at this.
In the future, the Batmobile is going to fly, because of course it will. What else do you need there? It is very visually reminiscent of the flying cars from Blade Runner, which makes sense because a lot of the design aesthetic of this particular show owes a lot to Blade Runner. At the time, people wondered why this version of Batman, the Terry McGinnis Batman, needed a flying car, because he can fly himself. His Batsuit allows him to fly. To that, I would say, you can walk, you also have a car. Not all crime happens next door. The Batman from 2004. Okay, you already noticed the pendulum is swinging back. We had very light, we had fluorescent and glowing and big wings, to something a lot more compact, a lot more powerful, a lot less flashy, more about sportiness and performance. It's a lot more butch than the Schumacher Batmobile.
I just thought I'd take it for a spin.
And in 2005, they redesigned the Batmobile for the Batman animated series. The original Batmobile in that series got totaled, so they introduced this version, and here we are again. We're going back out of the sense of fun and lightness to something much darker, much heavier, much more macho.
It's a black tank.
So again, we're going from light to dark, and now we're back to dark, firmly back to dark, and grim and gritty and purely functional. Nothing extraneous, no design for design's sake here. This is serious, this is manly, this is butch, this is no fun at all. This is Christopher Nolan. The design of this one, I was going to call it the Batmobile, but that'd be silly because this is Nolan's stated goal in making this film, was to disavow anything fun or campy about Batman, to dispel the ghost of Joel Schumacher. So it's not called the Batmobile, it's called the Tumbler. The Tumbler was the first thing designed for this film. Everything about it, in terms of production design, flowed from it. Nolan took a lump of clay, shaped it into this vaguely tank-like shape, and gave it to his production designer to go to town. This is all about practicality and power. A show of force, not style.
There's nobody left to send them.
So you got armor plating instead of Batwing. Nothing sleek or swooping or stylish here. This is a workhorse of pure functionality. And again, not to put too fine a point on it, it's not red, it's not black, it's not blue, it's gray. The influence of this film would be seen for a long time because the public loved it, the geeks loved it. Everybody came together and said, yes, this is the version of Batman that I like. The thing is, though, that this approach works great for Batman. If you try to apply this same approach to, say, I don't know, let me pick a name out of the hat, Superman, who is about hope and light, the tones don't mesh. The tone of a dark, gritty Batman makes sense. And it's one that has been in the comics since 1970. So it lines up with the comic book reader's sensibility, and it also makes for a good superhero film for the normals. And again, this is why comic book readers really gravitated to these films in a big way. They said, finally, this is the version of Batman that we've always had in our heads. Batman Gotham Knight, 2008. This is an anthology film, basically, a bunch of different stories. Now, take a look at this Batmobile. We are reaching a different kind of extreme. Instead of glitzy, sleek, and glamorous, we are now mashing up a literal fighter jet with a tank. This is Batman as manly. This is Batman as bro. Batman the Brave and the Bold, 2008. This series' mission statement was to pay loving homage to every era of Batman, so you get every era of the Batmobile. You get a Golden Age Bat-Touring Ram, you get the fenders, the single tail fin, but the details and the highlights come from the classic 1966 Batmobile. Everything about this seems more open to me, more playful, less defensive, less militarized. This is going away from the Christopher Nolan approach. It's less insistent that we take everything about Batman very seriously.
Stop.
Batman the Brave and the Bold, the 2009 redesign. We're getting even farther away from the militaristic here. We're leaning harder into the 1940s, specifically the 1940s comic book version of Batman in every detail. This could have leapt straight off the book page of a 1940s Batman comic. Batman Under the Red Hood. We don't see a lot of the Batmobile in this particular animated film, but what we do see is a cross between the Burton Batmobile and the sharper, curvier lines of some of the Batmobiles that came after it. But of course, it's post-Nolan, so we need that armor plating. Everything's about armor plating now.
Experience the world of Batman like never before.
Batman Live, 2011. Now, not many people actually got a chance to see this particular Batmobile because it was featured in a live stage stunt show that toured the US and the UK. Instead of stylized bat wings, you get a pretty standard spoiler. The shape is more reminiscent of Formula racing cars. It's like a broodier version of Speed Racer's Mach 5. And by the way, in terms of iconic fictional cars, it goes number 5, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, number 4, Herbie the Love Bug, number 3, Kit, number 2, Speed Racer's Mach 5, number 1, Batmobile, Fight Me. Beware the Batman animated series from 2013. This is very low and sporty. It's got the curvy fenders of a Formula 1 race car. It looks kind of what would happen if you stuck wheels on the flying Batmobile from Batman Beyond. Teen Titans Go, 2013. Again, we are now seeing the light to dark cycle speeding up. Here is an animated version of Tim Burton's Batmobile, just down to the turbine engine on the hood.
Let's see how this baby handles.
Once we arrive in South Cuckoo Land, we'll raise an army of master builders.
Yeah. Anyway, you guys gotta check out these new subwoofers I installed in the back.
The Lego Movie, 2014. We are now fully back into the light, into the sense of fun. To keep up with the film's very fun, fast approach, very fun, fast tone. Yeah, it looks like the Tumbler. Yes, it does. Tank-like. But again, you got those bat wings straight out of Joel Schumacher, which makes sense. It's a Lego. You can put things together from a lot of different eras. It's a stylistic mashup, really, and it makes a lot of sense.
I'll drive.
No.
I know how.
No.
Son of Batman, 2014. This animated film has a darker tone, so it took the familiar Brave and the Bold design and literally darkened it up. Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. Well, we're swinging back to the gray, militaristic, armored, but this doesn't quite have the ruthless functionality of the Tumbler. There is a half-hearted attempt at stylization here, at some familiar Bat iconography. There's something vaguely gothic about it, but again, machine guns. It's not the worst thing about the movie, but it is an ill-considered choice. It doesn't make a lot of sense for Batman. It's a violation of the character. But instead of feeling like a synthesis of a lot of different approaches, this thing feels caught between two different aesthetics. Is it a tank? Is it a race car? Is it a racing tank? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. This film was directed by Zack Snyder, who is a devotee of Ayn Rand, and you can tell that the dude does not believe in the whole notion of heroism. It's a rough fit, really, and that leaches into the design aesthetic of the film, into the grayness of these films, then into every aspect of design, including the Batmobile. It feels hopeless. It feels like there's no point. There's no reason to try to save others because nobody's trying to save you. It doesn't feel like the Nolan films, which at least were about the hero's journey. This feels like, what's the point? Critics didn't care for this film. The public liked it the first weekend and then not so much the second. This doesn't have a good reputation, and I think it's deservedly so. But that's only one approach to Batman after all, because in the Lego Batman movie,
you're welcome.
Batman, I love you more than my kids.
We are once again right back into the light, right back into the fun. We're getting tonal whiplash right now. This is a long roadster. Not to put too fine a point on it, but the Batmobile we see in this film is a lot like the Schumacher film Batman. It's a long roadster with a single seat, a great honking Batwing design. And again, he begins the film as a dark grim loner, which is why this Batmobile has a single-seat cockpit.
Hey, computer. I'm home.
The second Batmobile, 2017, the Lego Batman movie. By the end of the film, he's back to being the leader of an extended Bat family, so everything about this is bright and light here. And in fact, the design of this entire Batmobile is just a vehicle for Robin, a vehicle for Alfred, a vehicle for Batgirl, all smashed together. Justice League, 2017. Almost an instantaneous reversion to the light side. No more silliness. Now we're going to take this guy who dresses up as a bat so he can punch crime in the face. We're going to take it very seriously. Say this much about this version of the Batmobile in the Justice League film. It's a more effective synthesis of all the pre-existing Batmobiles, the live-action film Batmobiles. It's about 25% Burton, 10% Schumacher, 65% Nolan. And while the design of the Batmobile is an effective synthesis, the film itself is kind of a mashup. It feels like it's all over the place. It doesn't feel like the tone of Superman matches the tone of Batman. It feels like they're trying to mash these things together in a way that's not entirely effective.
V8, 5-litre, 460 horsepower engine.
Gotham, 2018. Now, this is not an official Batmobile. I won't call it that because it comes from a show about Batman before he was Batman, so let's call this the Master Bruce Mobile. It's a black Ford Mustang. That's all it is. What is interesting here is that this is the Batmobile as muscle car, which it hasn't been before. It's an interesting concept that's about to get fleshed out a lot more, but not before Titans, 2018. The DC Universe show introduced this version of the Batmobile in its 6th episode, and there's nothing new here. That's kind of the point. You want it to be instantly recognizable as the Batmobile. This is not a radical reinvention. Basically, you're just doubling down on previous designs. The Batman Live Batmobile, the Brave and the Bold Batmobile, the Under the Red Hood Batmobile. You got the twin bubble canopies. I told you they'd come back, and they did. Because, again, the influence of the 66 Batmobile just isn't going away. The Batman 2021, we've only gotten a glimpse of this so far. It's the one that will appear in the Matt Reeves film, but what we've seen looks interesting. It's basically a souped-up muscle car. Looks a lot like a Plymouth Barracuda. Nothing so prosaic or militaristic as a tank. It's built for speed and performance, and again, branding, instant recognizability. You see this and you think, Batman. We find ourselves at a weird point in the cycle because, again, while this looks like a very serious, grounded take on Batman, it's got some really big stylistic flourishes. So if the Batmobile is representative of how this Matt Reeves film is going to be, then we're going to find ourselves kind of at a crossroads. Instead of turning a cycle from light to dark, we're kind of bringing in both the light and the dark at the same time. Now, we don't have a lot to go on yet, but just by looking at the design of the Batmobile, looks like it's going to be a very grounded approach, a very practical approach to Batman. He's got a muscle car, but there's a lot of design flourishes which suggest something a little bit lighter. So instead of the cycle going round and round as it always has, this might represent a synthesis of light and dark, bringing him together, the light fun elements and the dark brooding elements. So looking at all these Batmobiles over the year, I hope it's clear that it's not just his car. It's not just a gadget. It's part of his character. It reflects how he changes over the years. And again, his evolution is not a linear one. He changes from light to dark and back again. And the Batmobile changes in shape and character and power and design again and again to reflect that. It's a part of who he is, an extension of who he is. It also looks pretty cool.